All right, welcome to this recorded lecture over learning target 5G, which is focusing on the brain. Today we're going to talk about identifying and explaining the function of the major areas of the brain. So we'll be able to both find them on diagrams, and we'll also be able to describe their function and what they do. And then we'll discuss what might happen if the areas were to malfunction. So not only would we be able to find them on a diagram and also talk about what they do, but you'd also be able to talk about what might happen if something were to go wrong. And of course, we're going to continue thinking about our big question for the unit, which is how is everything psychological also biological? We're really focusing on the idea that these biological systems aren't just discrete things in our bodies that just are there, but that they all have a really big impact on our psychological functioning as well. Now, for this particular video lecture, I really want you to think about us as like going on a journey. So we're going to start at the base of the head, just above the spinal column. And then we're going to head up to the limbic system from the old brain, and then we're going to move to the top regions of the cerebral cortex. This will be nice because it'll help us kind of think about these things geographically inside of your body, but it will also help us think about these things as coming at different evolutionary times in the process of human development. Starting at the hindbrain makes a lot of sense because those were the things that developed first, and then the limbic system came on the scene, and then finally the cerebral cortex developed. And as we move up the brain, you're going to notice that the different kinds of structures go from more sort of automatic to unconscious, and then finally to more conscious structures that have impacts on our active thinking processes. So we're going to start in the old brain, and the old brain is right here at the top of the spinal column. So there's your spine. And then right when we get to the top, the bone stops, and it gets encased in your cranium. And then we end up in the old brain, which is sometimes also called the hindbrain because it's the part of your brain that's sort of in the back of and underneath the rest of the brain. And so the structures we're going to look at are the reticular formation, the medulla, the pons, and the cerebellum. So the first of the structures right at the top of the spinal column is the reticular formation. The job of the reticular formation is to maintain our consciousness and levels of arousal. So if it weren't for the reticular formation, you wouldn't basically be able to wake up. You would be in a constant coma. And we know this because we've done some research with cats where we've severed the reticular formation, and the cats fall into a coma from which they can't be aroused without artificial stimulation from an electrical current. Reticular means web-like, and it's called that because it's sort of like a web-like series of neurons that sort of wrap around the top of the spinal column. And I guess a metaphor for the reticular formation might be something similar to the ignition in your car. I think about like when you put the key in the ignition and you turn the ignition, it turns over and then the car turns on. Your reticular formation does something very similar. It kind of gets the motor going inside of your brain. And so just to look at the diagram again, the reticular formation is right here. If we move up a little bit further, you find the medulla. The medulla are a series of neurons that create a neural structure that's responsible for maintaining all of the automatic functions of your body. So the medulla plugs directly into the autonomic nervous system to run some things like respiration, which is breathing. It gets your heart beating, and it also kind of helps with some basic reflexes like swallowing, coughing, and sneezing. And those come from the medulla as well. Right here we have a picture of Mike. Mike was a chicken, and at some point his owner went to cut his head off to turn him into edible chicken, and they chopped his head off. And normally what would happen is you chop the head of a chicken off and you throw it on the pile, and maybe once in a while it kind of move around and flop around a little bit, but eventually they kind of just bleed out and die. Mike stood back up and walked around, and he continued to live despite not having a head for several months after his decapitation. And the reason that Mike lived so long was twofold. Number one, there are these little arteries that come to the top of the head to feed the head with blood, and a blood clot formed in those at just the right moment and just the right spot to keep the chicken from bleeding out. The second thing is just by happenstance, the farmer happened to cut Mike directly above the medulla, and as a result, Mike had all of his basic functions intact. His heart was beating, he could still breathe, etc. And because swallowing is done by the medulla as well, all the farmer had to do was put a little water next to his neck, and then the swallowing reflex would take over and would move water into his body. And the same with little kernels of corn. So Mike lived for a long time. The farmer would carry around a little eyedropper because sometimes Mike would sort of choke on the things in his throat, and they would use the eyedropper to pull the fluids and stuff out of his throat so that he could stay alive. And then one day they forgot the eyedropper and Mike died. So Mike, the headless chicken, all thanks to his medulla. Going back up here, then the medulla is right here above the reticular formation, and it's sort of probably a good thing that it's encased so deep inside the spine of the brain because it's such an important part of your body. Moving up, we have the pons. So there's the pons on the diagram again. So we had the reticular formation down here, and then we moved up to the medulla, and now there's this big bulb spot at the top called the pons. And the biggest, I guess, if we were to just kind of distill all of what this says on the screen down into the main idea, one is that it helps you bundle execute commands together. So it sort of takes all the information from the higher brain regions and sort of puts them together into a simpler signal. But maybe the most important role of the pons is to paralyze your body when you're asleep. So if it weren't for your pons kind of shutting down your body when you go to sleep at night, you would get up and you'd move around and you would act out your dreams. But because the pons is there, the pons sort of shuts down the information from the brain so that it can't get to the body. And that protects you while you sleep so that you don't act out the things you're dreaming. A question often comes up then, like, what about sleepwalking? And one of the things that's interesting about sleepwalking is that it's more common in children than in adults. I bet some of you were sleepwalkers when you were little, and that was because you were up moving around because you were acting out the things that were going on in your mind while you were dreaming. And the answer might be that the pons is underdeveloped in children. It hasn't fully finished growing yet. As a result, it has a hard time doing its job effectively. The cerebellum is at the back of the skull, and it looks like a big wrinkly walnut. And it is primarily responsible for balance, coordination, basic muscle functions, and nonverbal learning. So learning that you don't have to talk or think with words to articulate. So kicking a kickball, swinging a bat, jumping on a trampoline, these are all things that you use your cerebellum for. Damage to the cerebellum could be problematic because if it were damaged, you would kind of feel dizzy all the time. You'd have a hard time staying coordinated. You'd have a hard time learning muscle tasks as well. All right, we're now moving out of the hindbrain and we're moving up into the limbic system. The limbic system was the area that developed later than the hindbrain or the old brain, but is still primarily unconscious. So though the functions of the limbic system are a bit more complex, they're still not really conscious processes. So the limbic system, broadly speaking, is responsible for things like processing emotions. It's also responsible for processing reward and pleasure, and helps us learn in a more unconscious way. So here's your limbic system. Down here you see there's the old brain that we've just left, so the reticular formation, medulla, pons, and the cerebellum. And now we've moved up into the limbic system. And you can see here some things we've talked about. In fact, I think a lot of these things we've talked about. One of them is the hippocampus, and then we have the amygdala. We're going to talk about the thalamus. There's the hypothalamus, which we talked about earlier in this unit. And then this big blue region up here, the cingulate gyrus, which we actually don't need to talk about in too much detail. That just happens to be on the diagram as well. So let's start with the hippocampus. So you know from our cognition unit that the hippocampus is responsible for processing short and long-term memory, and is also really important in the creation of spatial memories, which we call cognitive maps, which help us navigate our environment. So you can thank your hippocampus for letting you know both all of the important vocabulary terms in this class, but also how to get to the front door of this class. The hippocampus is responsible for both of those kinds of memory. If the hippocampus were to become damaged, it would become difficult to create new memories. And then you would basically have a form of amnesia called anterograde amnesia, which we learned about in our cognition unit, where you can't make new memories. If we move to the tip of the hippocampus, we run into a structure called the amygdala. And we've already learned a little bit about the amygdala, but the amygdala's primary responsibility is the processing of our emotional reactions to stimuli. And particularly, it allows us to have quick emotional reactions to things, particularly in response to fear and aggression stimuli. And then, of course, we know that a strong amygdala activation also supercharges the hippocampus, which creates flashbulb memories, which is review from our cognition unit as well. And of course, we know the evolutionary benefit of having these flashbulb memories is that we remember not to do that thing again. So if in an evolutionary time we were to walk into a cave and find a bear, we would probably have a flashbulb memory of our fight with the bear. And then as a result, we would know not to go in that cave again. So the amygdala, fear and aggression, processing of emotional stimuli, important in emotional learning. Here's a new structure that we haven't talked about yet. So now we're at the top of the limbic system, just below the cingulate gyrus, but above the hippocampus and the amygdala. And we've reached an area called the thalamus. The thalamus works as the switchboard operator in your brain. I've named the thalamus Thelma in my head. And Thelma is a switchboard operator, and she sits at the switchboard. And whenever a signal is coming in from your body, Thelma has to decide where to send it. So she will take in the signal and she'll say, oh, this is an auditory signal, and then she'll send it to the temporal lobe. Or she'll say, oh, this is a visual signal, and then she'll send it to the occipital lobe. So her job is to determine and decipher what the signal is, and then send it to the correct regions. At the very top of the limbic system, just before we get to the cerebral cortex, is an area of the brain called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum's responsibility is to act as an information superhighway between the left and right hemispheres of your brain. So you can see here this brain has obviously been removed, but it's also kind of dried a little bit so that it's pulled away a little bit of the cerebral cortex to expose the corpus callosum underneath. And what you can see is all these fibers running back and forth between the two hemispheres of the brain. Those fibers allow the right hemisphere to know what's going on in the left hemisphere, and the left hemisphere to know what's going on in the right hemisphere, so that the two hemispheres can coordinate with each other to direct your body and process your feelings and your thoughts and your memories. It is possible, and we'll talk about this in a later section, to cut the corpus callosum and make it so that the two hemispheres of the brain can no longer communicate. And when you do this, sometimes they do it to help people with seizures. Sometimes seizures will begin on one side, like on the left side, and then the seizure will bounce to the right side, and then it'll bounce to the left side, and it'll bounce to the right side, which makes the seizure a lot worse. It's almost like what happens when you hold a microphone up to a speaker and you get that feedback loop that makes the sound louder and louder and louder and more intense. Sometimes your brain does that, and that can make a seizure disorder a lot worse. So it's safe to cut away the corpus callosum. And then what you end up with essentially is two individually, independently functioning brains. And we're going to look at what split brain patients can do, and it's pretty remarkable in a later section. The cingulate gyrus is basically just the process of connecting our behavior to our motivation. So the cingulate gyrus's job is, for example, if you eat ice cream and that quick blood sugar spike comes and it makes you feel good, then in the future you'll learn to crave ice cream when you, and then it'll give you a motivation to eat ice cream in the future when your blood sugar is low. So the cingulate gyrus helps us connect how our behavior and consequences work together. Also inside the limbic system, this is, for me, I think, the most interesting part of our limbic system, which is called the reward circuitry. So inside the limbic system, a lot of these different pathways flow to the same area right here called the nucleus accumbens. And the nucleus accumbens is the master reward center of the brain. So in an accidental experiment, they were poking around inside the brains of mice, and they accidentally hit the nucleus accumbens, and suddenly they found that the mouse was sort of like acting like it does when it has a pleasurable treat. And what they discovered is that the nucleus accumbens, when you get a hit of dopamine to the nucleus accumbens, it gives you that sense of pleasure that you get from things like drugs, eating, sex, and all these other kinds of things that can give you a sense of pleasure. And so what scientists have since discovered is that the nucleus accumbens and the reward circuitry that leads to the nucleus accumbens, and then all the dopamine that happens to flow through those systems, all together they work basically to teach you what feels good and what doesn't feel good, so that you'll be motivated to do more of the things that feel good. And as a result, a lot of research is being done on this region and its effects on addiction. because we know that a lot of the most addictive substances work directly on these regions of the brain and produce their addictive effects. Okay, we are now moving excuse me, into the top layer of the brain called the cerebral cortex. So this was the very last thing that was developed in our brains. And the cerebral cortex is responsible for all of our higher order thinking skills. So our ability to reflect, our ability to plan, make decisions, think ethically, and think consciously are all the cerebral cortex is responsible for all of these. We're going to think about what are the major divisions and subdivisions of the cerebral cortex. Now, what I'm about to do is sort of simplifying, and I want to just make that very clear. So we know that the brain works all the time together as a single unit. And so it's not really fair to, it's sort of misleading to say that different areas of the brain are responsible for different things, because the brain sort of works together all the time. But just like a company works as one collective unit, there are different departments within that company that have special functions. So the company, the success or failure of the company depends on all of the individual parts. And you can identify those individual parts, like there's an accounting department, and there's a sales department, and there's quality control department. But they all work together to make the company successful. Your brain is very similar. There are specialized regions, but all of them work together all the time. Which gets to a point that some of you maybe heard myths before, like people are more left brain or right brain. That's not true. The brain works together all the time. Or that people only use 10% of their brain. That's also not true. You use all of your brain all the time. Another thing that's really interesting about your brain is that you are wired backwards. So in a moment, we're going to talk about a region of the brain called the motor cortex. And the motor cortex is responsible for voluntary actions. So like if I were to reach out to pick up my phone, that would be something I would be doing that's voluntary, that would originate in the motor cortex. But what's really interesting and kind of random about your brain is that the left side of my brain controls the right side of my body, and the right side of my brain controls the left side of my body. So it's important that you understand that the brain is wired backwards, because that's going to become really important when we begin to work on our understanding of split brain patients. The other thing is that in addition to being divided into left and right hemispheres that control the opposite sides of the body, each hemisphere is also divided into lobes. And each of the lobes have some different specialized functions. So the frontal lobe is what it sounds like. It's the front part of your brain. This word here is called parietal. The parietal lobe is responsible primarily for decoding sensations from your skin and your tongue. And down here we have the occipital lobe, which is primarily responsible for processing vision. And then over here we have the temporal lobe, which is primarily responsible for processing sound, plus a little bit more visual processing. Oh, and the frontal lobe is for voluntary actions and thinking. Also, the brain is sort of interesting because it's very wrinkly, and that's by design. The wrinkles, when they wrinkles outward, it's called a gyrus. It's a specialized name for any part of the brain that wrinkles outward. And when it wrinkles inward, it's called a sulcus. And so sometimes you'll see things as like such and such, which is on the third gyri of the frontal lobe, which would be saying it's on the third wrinkle of the frontal lobe. So sometimes scientists name different regions of the brain by describing which gyrus something is on or which sulcus it's in. There's a very particular reason, actually, that your brain is so wrinkly. Think about a piece of paper. Now, if you had like a big piece of paper, it would be difficult to fit that large piece of paper into a very small space unless you crumpled it up. And then if you took that paper and you crumpled it all up, it would be very easy to fit it inside a really little space. The reason your brain is so wrinkly is because your body is evolved to try to fit a very large surface area into a very small space inside of your cranium. And so as a result, your brain is basically crumpled up inside of your cranium so that it can fit more surface area into less space. Also, the brain has the cerebral cortex has some different kinds of tissue inside of it. Gray matter is the part that's really basically the bodies of the neurons. That's where most of the functioning happens. But a lot of the brain, a lot of the cerebral cortex is actually made up of stuff called white matter. White matter is this like fatty substance that's made mostly of myelin and axons and just glial cells. And remember, glial cells are those cells that sort of clean up after the neurons. after they do their job, and helps to provide support, repair, and nourishment to those neurons. So the gray matter actually is only a little bit of space, and then all the stuff to support the gray matter, the white matter, actually makes up a whole lot more of the brain. Okay, so this is, if you look at this at the first brush, it's very, very overwhelming, and I'm totally aware of that. But I'm only using this diagram to sort of illustrate where we're going to go. Okay, so now that we're at the cerebral cortex, we're going to start at the front, and we're going to work our way back, and we're going to talk about these different areas, and then we're going to cycle up to the temporal lobe. So we're going to start basically behind your forehead, and then we're going to move all the way to the back of the brain, and then we're going to come forward a little bit and go behind your ears. And that's going to be that sort of path we're going to take. And though this diagram is confusing, maybe, and a little overwhelming, by the time we're done, we'll have broken down every single one of these little brain regions on the cerebral cortex, and you'll be able to talk a little bit about what they're responsible for. So let's start on the frontal lobe. So let's take this piece by piece. Let's eat this in small bites, and we'll really understand it. So the frontal lobe is the piece that's on the front side of the brain, and the very first place we're going to start is the prefrontal cortex, or the PFC. We've already discussed the PFC to some degree in the cognition unit, but the prefrontal cortex, again, as review, is responsible for decision making, planning, and sometimes it's called the executive function, which is something you've also learned about. The executive function is basically just like deciding what to pay attention to, deciding what to remember, deciding what to call up into short-term memory, and also deciding, making future decisions, etc. Sometimes it's also called the CEO of your brain. So if you think about your brain again as a company, this is the head of the company. This is the person who makes the final decisions about everything and directs the other regions of the brain. Some people even describe it as like this is where you live, like this is kind of where your consciousness comes from. If we move now to the back, so we've gone on the frontal lobe and we've moved to the back of the frontal lobe, you'll find an important region of your brain called the motor cortex, sometimes also called the primary motor cortex or the primary motor area. The motor cortex is responsible for executing actions that are voluntary. So the motor cortex connects directly to the somatic nervous system and allows you to do things like kick a ball, pick up a pencil, write, and that kind of stuff. All originates from the motor cortex. And then remember, it's wired backwards. So the left motor cortex controls the right side, and the right motor cortex controls the left side. So when I decide to pick up, I'm left-handed, so when I decide to pick up a pencil with my left hand, I'm using my right motor cortex. This is actually kind of important because it helps doctors sometimes take a guess at where a patient might have suffered a stroke or might have grown a brain tumor. So if a person with a stroke suddenly goes limp on the right side of their face, it's a pretty good guess to say that the stroke happened on the left side of the brain. And then doctors can go looking for that to figure out where the stroke happened. Also on the frontal lobe is an area of the brain that's just next to but slightly below and beside the motor cortex called Broca's area. Broca's area is responsible for encoding our speech commands. So and then it sends that signal to the motor cortex to move the mouth to make speech sounds. So the brain has a specialized region where it basically creates an intention to speak something, and then the Broca's area directs the motor cortex to move the mouth to make the appropriate sounds to make understandable language. This is important. Two things are important about Broca's area. Number one is Broca's area is only on the left side of the brain of normally developing individuals. So you will not find a Broca's area on the right side of your brain. You'll only find it on the left side of your brain. And then sometimes if that area were to become damaged, you can develop something called aphasia. Broca's aphasia would be an inability to speak. So you wouldn't be able to create comprehensible verbal sounds. This happened to me the other day. I was like waking up from a deep sleep, and I don't think my brain had quite fully turned on yet. And for some reason, I started trying to talk. I was trying to talk to my Alexa, and what came out was just a garbled mess of words because I don't think my Broca's area was quite awake yet. It was a very bizarre experience. Some people get damage to that area that's constant, like it's just that area is damaged, and so they can't speak anymore. So they know what they want to say, but it just comes out as a garbled mess, and it's very frustrating. And that's called Broca's aphasia. Notice that Broca's area is only responsible for the speaking part of language. The listening and understanding part of language is a different region of the brain. So these people are aware that the words they're saying don't make sense because they can hear themselves speaking and they know that it's just a garbled mess. Okay, we're moving now behind the frontal lobe and we're going to the parietal lobe. So you'll see right here, there's a really deep sulcus, and that's that inward wrinkle, and that's the indication that we've left the frontal lobe and we've moved to the next lobe, which in this case is the parietal lobe. And the very first thing you'll run into on the parietal lobe is the somatosensory cortex. And the job of the somatosensory cortex is to process stimuli from our skin and from our tongue. So it helps us process like what you're feeling. It helps like if something like lands on your hand, you can feel it because of your somatosensory cortex. And it also helps you process what you taste. So if you were eating like some bubble gum, the bubble gum you'd be tasting you'd be tasting it because of decoding in your somatosensory cortex. And again, different areas of the body are controlled by different areas of the cortex. So there's a specialized region for like feeling the bottom of your foot, or there's a specialized region for moving your foot. Each of the motor and somatosensory cortex have specialized regions responsible for different things. We can show this graphically with a graphic representation called a homunculus. So a homunculus is this thing where they've taken the body and they've kind of spread it out over the cortex to show what different regions are responsible for different things. So if you look on the left side, those are your motor. That's your motor map. So that shows where what part of the motor cortex is responsible for moving what parts of the body. And then on the right side is the sensory map. So that shows you which parts of the cortex are responsible for feeling different parts of the body. You'll notice on both the motor and the sensory cortex, the face gets a lot of airtime. So the face has a lot of area devoted specifically to both movement and sensation. You think about it, the most sensitive place on your body is actually right around your mouth and your lips. That's like the most sensitive place. So the mouth gets a really big region devoted to it. Likewise, there are tons and tons of tiny, tiny little muscles in your face that are responsible for making all of your different emotions and like being able to display your emotions, being able to talk, all these things. So a large area needs to be devoted in the motor cortex to your face. Now, if we move back behind the parietal lobe, we enter the occipital lobe. The primary job of the occipital lobe is to maintain the primary visual cortex. So the visual cortex's job is to help you decode what you see. So the back of your head is where if you were like looking at a beautiful painting, you'd be using your occipital lobe to see the painting and interpret and decode the painting. And notice there are different pathways that then go out of the occipital lobe's visual cortex into different regions of the brain, into different association areas. So the mangocellular pathway is the one where you try to interpret where the thing is in space. So where is it relative to everything else? And then the pavocellular pathway is the pathway which asks, what am I looking at? So right now I'm sitting in my classroom and I'm looking at the fern next to the window. The where is being processed in the rest of my occipital lobe. The what is actually being processed in my temporal lobe, where I'm determining what I'm looking at. But again, the primary decoding of visual stimuli happens in the occipital lobe. Okay, now we're going to move to the temporal lobe, and we're going to find the primary auditory cortex. The primary auditory cortex is the area that receives information from the ears. So when we get a signal from our ears, it goes to the temporal lobe's primary auditory cortex for decoding. And it's kind of where we learn what different sounds sound like. So you know what the sound of your friend's voice sounds like because of your temporal lobe. Or you know what the sound of a bird sounds like because of your temporal lobe. There are lots of association areas in the temporal lobe that helps us know what different sounds mean. Also, right next to the primary auditory cortex is an area called Wernicke's area. And Wernicke's area's job is to decode meaning from a language sound. So if a sound comes into your temporal lobe and goes to the primary auditory cortex, and the primary auditory cortex determines that the sound is language, it sends that signal to Wernicke's area, and then Wernicke's area determines what the meaning of the sound was. So if I say the phrase like the big dog jumped over the fence, when I say that, it goes to your auditory cortex. Your auditory cortex says, "Hey, that's a meaningful sentence in English," and then it sends that signal to Wernicke's area, and then Wernicke's area tells you what I said just mean, like what it means, what I just said. The Wernicke's area can become damaged as well, and that creates something called Wernicke's aphasia. So Wernicke's aphasia would be an inability to listen to people speaking and understanding what they're saying. So if your Wernicke's area were damaged, you wouldn't be able to understand what anyone was saying to you. On the bottom part of the temporal lobe, and I'm going to emphasize that this is on the right side only, is a very special visual association area called the facial association area. So you are able to determine who you're looking at. Like if you look at a person's face, you're able to tell who they are based completely on this tiny little region on the right temporal lobe called the facial association area. And actually, it's possible for that area to become damaged, and then people become what's called face blind. So you basically, someone walks in the room and you look at their face and you have no idea who they are until they tell you who they are. And of course, you know who they are. So once they're like, "Hey, I'm your friend Sarah," then you're like, "Oh, yeah, of course." And then you're able to tell who they are. But just by looking at their face, you wouldn't be able to tell, because our ability to recognize faces is stored in a special area. Notice also there's a large region of the temporal lobe on the right side that's dedicated to perceiving facial expression. Emotional expressions on faces are very, very important to humans. We learned a little bit about that in social psych when we discovered that the chameleon effect helps us empathize with each other, and that we are inherently social creatures. And the brain, the biological component of that psychological phenomenon, is these areas of the temporal lobe responsible for perceiving facial expression. I just want to emphasize one more time real quick that all of the speech circuitry, so Wernicke's area, Broca's area, and your ability to decode and create speech is all on the left side of your brain. It does not exist on the right side. So in normally developing individuals, if the left side of the brain became damaged, it would become really problematic for your ability to speak or to understand speech. And actually writing as well. I bet that's a question that's on some of your minds. Does it impact writing? And the answer is yes. However, if your right side became damaged, if you're a normally developing individual, it probably wouldn't make any difference to your ability to speak or understand language. It might make you a little bit, it might make it difficult to understand sort of intent of speech, because a lot of that poetic stuff happens on the right side. But just the raw meaning of a sentence wouldn't be affected if your right side became damaged. So we call this the language left. That's the left side of the brain that's responsible for all that language. And that is it for the brain.